So what everyone thinks of when they think about the 1960s and the 1970s is the counterculture movement, the hippies, right? That's what everyone thinks of. And all of this is summed up in, three categories: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Those are the three pieces of this counterculture movement that we're going to be talking about. So we'll start with the sexual revolution. So the hippies of the 1960s ushered in this new wave of social thought, and ideas about sex and gender were dramatically changing from the traditional values that were encouraged by that post-war period. The nuclear family, only children inside of marriage, sex is only for marriage, women are only for having kids and serving the family, things like that. Sex is starting to be separated from its traditional ties to marriage and family. In fact, some of the most groundbreaking scientific studies ever done about sex were done in the 1960s. There was a book published in 1962 by Helen Brown called Sex and the Single Girl, about women, social thought about single women and sex. And then the scientific study called Human Sexual Response, done and published in 1966 by William Masters and Virginia Johnson. Showtime even did a TV show about it called Masters of Sex, because his last name is Masters, about the two of them doing all of this research. And we learned so much. And it's really because ideas about all of this are becoming, things are a little more open, and people are a little more willing to talk about this. When in the 50s, no doctor would have ever dared to do a scientific study on sexual response, because they would have been, absolutely crucified by the medical community. Number 2, drug use. Hippies are really known for their use of drugs, specifically psychedelic drugs and hallucinogenics. So a lot of experimentation is starting to expand, not just part of the counterculture movement. We're seeing it expand into the middle class as well. So, mostly the counterculture movement, like I said, psychedelics, things like LSD, shrooms, anything like that. But we're starting to see marijuana become a lot more popular among the more mainstream middle class. It's starting to become a lot more rampant, and obviously is very rampant today. And then the last thing, music. I would probably say that music is the most important and most significant piece of all of this, because it incorporates everything else. So music and pop culture became incredibly vital to the counterculture movement. There were songs about drugs all over the radio. The song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles and the song Tambourine Man by Bob Dylan is about a drug dealer. And they're not necessarily coming right out and talking about, drugs. It's all laid in metaphor, but everyone knows what they mean. We also are going to see really the largest and most famous music festival of all time, the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, in August of 1969. It was in upstate New York. 300,000 people gathered there for about 3 days, and it was filled with music, drugs, sex, all these crazy hippies. It's definitely one of the most famous music festivals that we've ever had, and has gone on to inspire music festivals in the future like Bonnaroo and Coachella. So the environmental movement is really going to get its shining moment here when we get to the 1960s and 70s. So after World War II, people became a lot more aware of the wilderness and conservation. We had seen some conservation, back with Teddy Roosevelt creating national parks and things like that. But we didn't know a lot. So there wasn't really a lot to be done. By the time we get to 1970, we know a lot, and there definitely is some significant steps that we can take to protect our planet. People began to start protesting the use of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons testing. So we're really starting to see us become more knowledgeable of what humans are doing and how that can impact the planet. So Rachel Carson, this woman here at the bottom, publishes this book called Silent Spring, and it really kicks off this environmental movement of the 1970s. It's all about the effects of chemicals in our environment, specifically on birds. So when you think of spring, you think of like babies, like baby animals and birds singing and flowers blooming and all of that. And what Rachel Carson is depicting here is a silent spring, one without baby birds singing, because what we're doing is we're polluting our planet and damaging the air quality so much that we might see less birds and a decline in our bird species as time goes on. Her book was extremely influential and sparked a massive protest movement. So in 1970, we get the Earth Day demonstrations, creating Earth Day, and we've had Earth Day ever since. And I know it's coming up pretty soon. I know it's this month. So we get some pretty big new laws in the 1970s that Richard Nixon signs. In 1970, he creates the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, which is the branch of the federal government that handles environmental laws and procedures. In 1970, he also passes the Clean Air Act, which sets standards on the type of pollution and gas emissions that companies can put out. 1972, we get the Water Pollution Control Act. That one's pretty self-explanatory. And then in 1973, the Endangered Species Act to protect our animals. So there are two significant environmental issues that we can talk about from this era: the Love Canal incident and the 3 Mile Island. So Love Canal is an area in upstate New York, and companies had been dumping tons of toxic and harmful chemicals into the canal for years, and residents of that community who had been using that as their water source had been experiencing disease and birth defects for years and years and years because of the contamination. We finally really figured it out in the 1970s and managed to shut the whole thing down. And this is going to play a huge role in that water pollution movement as we go forward and those bills. And then 3 Mile Island is a nuclear energy plant in Pennsylvania, and it almost had a meltdown, which means that it almost literally exploded, this nuclear power plant. And that's really dangerous because in Pennsylvania, if this power plant exploded, it would not only probably take out the whole state of Pennsylvania, but it could cause some damage to our capital and surrounding states. So the governor had to declare a state of emergency. They managed to prevent it from melting down, but they had to shut the entire plant down. And to this day, you still cannot go out to 3 Mile Island.